in the final installment of this walk through the digestive system, we get to the large intestine. Now, we left off talking about the small intestine and about how little bits of chyme are going to pass into the large intestine after all of the nutrients we're going to get are absorbed over the ileum wall. Now, the very first part of the large intestine is the cecum. Here is the end of the ileum. And so this here is the ileocecal valve. And so the chyme is going to be mixed with the content of the cecum as soon as it enters into the large intestine. The cecum is this distal pouch, right? So it's a blind-ended pouch. We can see the vermiform appendix sticking off the back of it. And essentially, the cecum is more or less a hotel for bacteria, right? So it is a really cushy environment in which bacteria are going to live. And so immediately chyme is mixed with the contents, the bacterial contents, in fact, of the cecum. Okay. The large intestine is about a little bit less than 5 feet. And it's called the large intestine, not because it's super long, but because it is much wider. Keep in mind that at this point, the chyme has had most of the good stuff removed from it. And what's left is waste. So here we are now talking about feces. No longer are we absorbing nutrients. Instead, we are only absorbing water and electrolytes, so the salts. We are compacting waste into feces. We are absorbing vitamins, right? So just the vitamins, not the biomolecules themselves. And also the bacteria are responsible for making some of these vitamins as well. And finally, the large intestine is also a storage organ. It does store feces until a bowel movement. Okay. Now, the large intestine also looks a little bit different than the nice, smooth, consistent small intestine. What we can see are these little bumps, these little pouches called haustra or singular haustrum, makes the colon look a bit segmented. And this white line here is muscular and tendinous. And so this is called the teniae coli, or quite literally the tendon of the colon. And so again, in the large intestine, we are now moving a solid waste product as opposed to a liquid, nutrient-rich product that we are still getting getting stuff out of. Okay, so it's a lot more work. You need a lot more strength and also a lot more lubrication in order to propel feces through the large intestine than you would to propel chyme through the small intestine. Okay, the colon is divided up into 4 different regions: the ascending colon, the transverse colon, descending, and sigmoid. So let's go back here. Cecum into the ascending, transverse, descending, sigmoid, and finally down into the rectum. The root rect, rectum means straight. So this portion of the large intestine is straight up and down. Okay. The ascending and descending colons are actually retroperitoneal, right? So they are not covered by the peritoneum either. The colon is no longer absorbing a lot of nutrients or any nutrients anymore. And so it doesn't need a ton of surface area to provide opportunities for that. And so if we take a look at the stomach versus small intestine versus large intestine, the small intestine is the only one with those villi. Okay. Instead of having villi, the large intestinal lining is lined with a ton of mucus cells. Again, mucus provides lubrication. We are now moving a solid, becomes drier, becomes more compact, and so lubrication is going to be key in this organ's function. The mucosa does not produce enzymes. Okay, so again, we are not digesting food anymore. This is just storage of waste and compaction for smaller bowel movements. No more enzymes. Enzymes are produced and expressed in the small intestine, not in the large intestine. Okay, so what is in the feces at this point besides waste that we, have absolutely no use for? Well, there's still a lot of fiber as long as you are eating enough fiber, right? So what exactly is fiber as opposed to normal old carbohydrates? Like when we talk about carbs, we can talk about starch, right? Lots of potatoes, right? Glycogen, this animal storage product. And we can also talk about cellulose. And cellulose is not digestible by humans. It's not digestible by any animals, in fact. And so all 3 of these are actually made of glucose monomers. They're considered to be polysaccharides. But this one, we can't digest. And so what is going on with that? Well, in between the glucose monomers, there are actually different bond angles, right? So cellulose has about 180 degrees, starch has an acute angle here. Remember that enzymes are specific to their substrate. Amylose can digest or can be digested by amylase, right? Amylase recognizes this bond angle and it can break those bonds nice and easily. And then finally, amylose is broken into 2 monomer little units, which are then further broken down into individual glucose monomers. Okay, so we actually express the 2 enzymes for these molecules. On the other hand, we cannot digest cellulose because the bond angle of cellulose is not recognized by amylase. It's only recognized by cellulase. Okay, so cellulase breaks cellulose into little disaccharides, and these disaccharides are broken down into glucose molecules by a different enzyme. We do not have the gene for this, right? Your dog doesn't have the gene for this. Like rabbits don't have the gene for this, right? No mammals have the cellulase and cellobiase genes. So what do we do? Why do we eat fiber? What happens to all of that stringy fibrous material when we do eat it? Well, cellulose is essentially dietary fiber. We can't make the cellulase enzyme, but our friends, the bacteria, can make this enzyme. And so microflora, or the bacteria that are housed in our cecum, right? Or housed in the rumen if we're talking about a cow or something. Okay, the cecum is specially designed to support bacteria that actually make this enzyme. And so when we eat fiber, can actually break it down into glucose. So you might say, okay, well, the bacteria are living in the colon. They can digest this and produce glucose. All right, great. Like we have more glucose, more energy. Not quite. Essentially, the bacteria can break down the fiber that we feed them into glucose, and they can utilize the glucose for themselves. All right, so why the heck do we care? So we're just feeding bacteria for the heck of it, our little pet bacteria, hooray, right? Not quite. Okay. Dietary fiber is really important in a lot of different things. And so you're welcome to watch this video. I'm not going to play it for you now, but it is in your notes, in fact. But essentially, it is recommended to eat at least 25 grams of fiber a day for women, 35 to 40 for men. And essentially this is feeding those gut flora. And so on the surface, this increases the bulk of stool. You might say, I've never really had a problem with the volume of my poop. Why do I care about that? But it does make defecation easier. So that's nice as well. Maybe a little bit more appealing to us than thinking about bowel movements is that some fiber actually traps lipids and it traps carbohydrates. So if you are diabetic or pre-diabetic, or if you are trying to work on your cholesterol levels, if you eat more soluble fiber, so think about like oatmeal and beans, right? So when you mix water in with them, they become like mushy. Essentially, that's happening within your intestines as well. And that actually traps sugar. It traps extra fat, right? And essentially brings it all the way to the colon. It traps it for a while, slowly releasing the sugar, slowly releasing the lipids so that you don't have this spike of blood sugar and then all of a sudden an energy crash. Okay. Also, some of it is in fact completely trapped and taken to your colon. And so you are not getting as much fat, on your thighs as you would otherwise be doing. Okay. Also, finally, and by far the most important reason, it feeds the good gut flora. So we know that we have about 500 species of bacteria in our colon, and this is much greater than what's in our oral cavity. This does vary from place to place and from diet to diet. Essentially, you can day by day alter what species are living in your gut and how abundant they are. You vary them by essentially what you feed them. The ones that are the most helpful to our behavior and our health are the ones that really, really like to eat fiber. Eating lots of broccoli feeds the good bacteria, and eating lots of trans fats and processed food and everything, the bad bacteria really like to eat those things instead. In general, these species, whether good or bad, are obligate anaerobes, which means that they do not like oxygen. They just like to hang out in the confines of your colon. And so I bring this up because there are, of course, a lot of different things that you see in the news that are like the miracle cures. They will help you to, lose weight and, degunk your colon, all these different things. And so this one here says oxy powder, oxygen-based intestinal cleanser. And so supposedly you're carrying around 40 pounds of extra sludge in your intestines all the time. And this oxygen is going to help you get rid of that sludge. Well, first of all, no. First of all, even if you're getting a colonoscopy, right, when you drink the stuff and you completely wipe out your entire colon so that the physician can take images of the intestinal lining, you might lose about 5 pounds, right? So that means that maximum you have about 5 pounds of feces in your colon at any given point, and that's the function of the colon, right? So cleaning out your intestines is just kind of bogus, right? Also, even if you wanted to clean out your intestines, if you wanted to, drink the colonoscopy juice, oxygen, right? This is actually killing off the bacteria that are so very helpful to your existence, right? So I bring this up just to throw it out there that there's a lot of miracle cures, but now that you know more about the human body, maybe you can approach these miracle cures with a little bit more knowledge and can recognize the nonsense where there is nonsense. Okay, so why do we want bacterial friends? All right, first of all, they are going to convert some of the food that's left over in our feces into molecules that really sustain the function of our epithelial lining, right? So they essentially are the housekeepers of our colon, right? If you don't have healthy colon flora, your chances of getting colon cancer are greatly increased, right? Your digestive issues are greatly increased, right? Your inflammation of your bowel and regularity also greatly increased, right? So these guys are very helpful to maintaining our colon in a healthy way. Just throwing it out there, it is their methane, not ours. So the bacteria in your colon are the ones that produce methane as a byproduct. So that is gas, and it is them, not us. So maybe that makes you feel a little bit better about yourself. Immunity. Right, so these good bacteria are constantly fighting off pathogenic bacteria. Right, so just as one example, one example, Lactobacillus species, which is actually one of the main probiotic species if you take probiotics. But Lactobacillus essentially produces lactic acid and hydrogen peroxide as byproducts of just like living and doing its thing in your colon. And a lot of pathogenic bacteria, as well as yeast, so the yeast infection yeast, Candida albicans, they are really susceptible to damage by hydrogen peroxide. So essentially you are sterilizing your colon all the time, as well as the orifices that open up into the outside world, right? So anus, vaginal orifice, etc. And so these bacteria are actually keeping all of these pathogenic bacteria and yeast at bay. Okay, if you take antibiotics, essentially you are killing off the bacteria that are helping you, and so you might be more prone to a yeast infection or other things because this delicate ecological balance in your gut is thrown off. Okay, bacteria are also really important in synthesizing vitamins. So they make vitamin K and help us to get vitamin B12. Right? So all these things are happening in your colon as well. On top of that, there have been countless studies that connect a healthy community of gut flora to weight, right? And so that's what these mice are doing up in the corner. Maybe you were wondering why I had this picture. Classic study at this point in like 2014, sterilized the guts of 2 mice, right? They took fat mouse flora, put it in skinny mouse. They took skinny mouse flora, they put it in fat mouse, and essentially with the same diet, with the same exercise, same lifestyle entirely, the fat mouse got skinny with skinny mouse bacteria, and the skinny mouse got fat. The only thing that was different was the bacteria. And so, of course, we thought this was the solution, right? We just need floral transplants in our gut, and then everything will be okay. We'll be the weight that we want to be. Of course, it's a lot more complicated than that. Fecal transplants are a thing, but it's not the cure that we were looking for. But it is really important in regulating how you handle different nutrients. The bacteria are really important in regulating your hunger, right? So lots of evidence shows how much they're talking back and forth to your brain saying, hey, I want this, I want that. And so this is why if you eat lots of processed foods, you are feeding the bad bacteria. And so the bad bacteria are the only ones that are able to grow in your gut. And so they are the only ones that are talking to your brain. And so they're going to tell your brain, I need more processed food. I need more processed food because that's what we like. And that's who you started feeding. And so now we're the only ones who are talking. All right, so eat your fruits and veggies, feed the good bacteria, they really help. One more thing, and I could go on and on about all this stuff, but if you can't tell, there is a strong connection between mental health, mental well-being, and having a healthy gut flora as well. So this gut-brain connection is very strong, and you really want to feed the bacteria that are going to have you eating the good stuff and feeling the good way. Highly recommend looking into this in more detail. Okay, so the colon is responsible for absorbing water. It's responsible for absorbing vitamins and electrolytes. Feeding our good bacteria to keep all of our entire body healthy. When it is finally ready to pass feces. Essentially, the feces is going to enter into the rectum. Right, the additional stretch is going to trigger a reflex. Okay, and so essentially, it will trigger a bowel movement. Right, there are actually two different circular muscles that control when a bowel movement happens and when it cannot happen. And good thing, the internal anal sphincter. Right, this right here is not under voluntary control. It is a smooth muscle layer. And so essentially, whenever there is feces in the rectum, it will open up, right? So any stretch is going to trigger this to open up. But good thing we can decide when it's convenient to have a bowel movement and when it's not convenient to have a bowel movement. The external anal sphincter is around the outside of the internal, and essentially we can consciously say, okay, it is appropriate. You can relax now, anal sphincter, and now feces can pass through the anus. Okay, so we have both reflexive control that we have no conscious decision over and conscious control. Again, good thing, not everyone has the external anal sphincter, okay? As in not every animal has the external anal sphincter. Right, so think about how birds just like defecate all over your car. They can't really control it as much as you'd like them to. Now, you're not going to potty train a pigeon. Okay. All right. One thing about hemorrhoids, essentially there is a lot of vasculature around these muscles. Keep in mind that the internal and external sphincters are contracted, closed, like almost all the time, except for when you are having a bowel movement. And so they need lots of blood, lots of energy. And so there's a lot of blood vessels around your anus. And so if your abdominopelvic cavity has a lot of pressure built up, right? So for example, childbirth, for example, a lot of constipation, this builds up a lot of pressure. Okay, this is going to essentially weaken the walls of the veins around the anus. And so remember that these are already thin-walled vessels. With a lot of pressure, it's going to allow blood to build up in them, right, and not actually be able to flow back to the heart. And so the walls of the blood vessels can actually protrude into the anal canal, and these are called hemorrhoids. Another thing that can cause hemorrhoids is sitting down for a long time, right, which is a little rough to hear about in the age of COVID, but sitting down for a long time, you're truck driver, you are working a desk job all the time. Essentially, this entire area is kind of crushed all the time. And again, blood is going to accumulate here, and without proper skeletal muscle movement, the blood is not going to be able to return to the heart. And so the vein walls might protrude out into the anal canal. Right? So that is obviously not comfortable either. Okay. Mass movements, right? So a bowel movement or leading to a bowel movement. Mass movements are powerful peristaltic contractions. These are triggered by a meal, right? So your stomach stretching will essentially make room in your colon for incoming food. It is pre-programmed in to have, regular times every day, like mass movements are happening, right? Moving feces along quite a lot until there's enough room for incoming food. Okay. Let's see. Yeah, so those are mass movements. The chyme entering into the large intestine is about 1.5 liters. Over 1 liter of this water is reabsorbed as long as the chyme, or at this point the feces, spends enough time within the large intestine. Now, if you are eating, something that your body decides it does not want to have inside it for very long, essentially this can be pushed along rather rapidly and not give enough time to reabsorb enough water. And so that would be diarrhea. But ideally, about 1 liter of this water is reabsorbed, and there's only about 200 milliliters or so of feces that is ejected during a bowel movement. All right, last slide, last part of this story today, and that is the defecation reflex. As I said, this entire process begins with stretch on the rectal wall. So essentially, with those powerful mass movements, more feces is pushed down through the sigmoid colon into the rectum. This is going to cause distension of the rectum. And so there are stretch receptors within the walls, and they are essentially going to communicate this stretch information back up, stimulating that myenteric plexus, that part of the autonomic nervous system within the walls of the intestine, to contract the colon all at once and push the feces along towards the anal canal. Lucky for us, there's also a long reflex, which also asks our brain for permission. Is this an appropriate time? Yes, the internal sphincter might be relaxed. It might be ready to let the feces fly, but instead, the external anal sphincter does not have to be relaxed until you decide that it's ready and it's time. Okay, so again, thank you very much for watching this final segment today. I hope that the questions help you, and I will see you in our next class.